The morning sky was still dark when Eleanor Chen woke up in her modest apartment. At 68 years old, her body protested with small aches as she got ready for her new job. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, her face lined with wrinkles that told stories of both joy and hardship. With careful hands, she pulled her gray-streaked black hair into a simple bun, making sure not to leave a single strand out of place. Today was her first day as a janitor at Westfield Corporate Plaza, and she wanted to look neat, even in her plain blue uniform. 20 years ago, she would have arrived at a different office building wearing an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase filled with important papers. Back then, people called her Dr. Chen, and young professionals would scramble to hold doors open for her. Elena smiled at the memory as she packed a simple lunch: rice, steamed vegetables, and the special tea her daughter had sent from Taiwan. The bus ride to Westfield Plaza was long, and Eleanor used the time to watch the city wake up. People hurried past in expensive coats, clutching coffee cups and staring at phones. None of them noticed the elderly woman in the worn-out coat. The Westfield building stood tall and proud among other skyscrapers, its glass windows reflecting the morning sun. Elena took a deep breath before entering through the staff entrance at the back. The security guard barely looked at her new ID badge before waving her through. "Janitor's lockers are down the hall to the left," he said, already turning his attention to his phone. The small locker room smelled of cleaning products and instant coffee. Two other cleaners, a young Hispanic woman and an older black man, nodded politely as Eleanor stored her lunch bag. "You're new?" the man asked, his voice kind as he introduced himself as Robert. "Been here 15 years myself." "First day," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "Stick with me," Robert offered. "I'll show you which floors to avoid when certain people are around." The first few hours passed quietly as Robert showed Eleanor how to properly clean the executive bathrooms, which trash bins to empty first, and which coffee stains were considered emergencies. Eleanor listened carefully, her hands working efficiently despite their slight arthritis. Most employees walked past without seeing her, their eyes focused on screens or conversations about stocks and profit margins. "Like we're invisible," Robert whispered when a group of young executives stepped around them without pausing their loud conversation. "You'll get used to it." But Eleanor was already used to it. That was exactly why she was here, to be invisible, to see what happened when people thought no one important was watching. By lunchtime, Eleanor had cleaned 14 bathrooms, emptied dozens of trash cans, and wiped hundreds of fingerprints off glass surfaces. In the small break room, she sat with Robert and learned about his grandchildren while they ate. "They're smart kids," he said proudly, showing pictures on his old flip phone. "My grandson just got accepted to college, first in our family." Eleanor's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful," she said sincerely. "Education changes everything." The afternoon brought Eleanor to the 22nd floor, executive territory. The carpet was thicker here, the artwork on walls more expensive. As she quietly dusted a conference room, she overheard two women talking in the hallway. "Victoria's on the warpath again," one whispered. "She made her assistant cry this morning over a typo." "That woman is a nightmare," the other replied. "But she brings in big accounts, so nobody says anything." Eleanor filed the name away in her memory, Victoria. She continued dusting, moving slowly around the room full of expensive furniture. On the wall hung framed photos of company executives. In one corner stood her old friend James, his familiar smile bringing back memories of business deals and charity galas from years ago. As the day ended and Eleanor rode the bus home, her body was tired in ways it hadn't been in decades. But her mind was sharp, taking mental notes of everything she'd seen and heard. This was just the beginning. She had a purpose here, one that nobody, especially not someone named Victoria, would ever suspect from an elderly janitor with stooped shoulders and quiet ways. Tomorrow would bring more observations, more information. Elena smiled to herself as she watched the city lights through the bus window. Sometimes the most powerful position was the one nobody noticed at all. Victoria Hayes strutted through the glass doors of Westfield Corporate Plaza at exactly 8:45 a.m., the same time she arrived every day. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, creating a rhythm that made people glance up with a mixture of admiration and fear. At 35, Victoria had mastered the art of making an entrance. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail that swung as she walked, and her navy blue suit was tailored to perfection. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," the receptionist called out nervously. Victoria barely nodded in response, her eyes already fixed on her phone where she scrolled through emails. The elevator ride to the 22nd floor was Victoria's morning ritual for checking her appearance. She used the mirrored walls to ensure not a single hair was out of place. Today was important. The quarterly review meeting where she planned to present her department's achievements, or rather what she claimed were her achievements. "Hold the door," someone called as the elevator began to close. Victoria pressed the close button repeatedly, pretending not to hear. She preferred riding alone, especially when running through her presentation in her head. When Victoria reached her office, her assistant Thomas jumped up from his desk, a cup of coffee already prepared exactly how she liked it, one sweetener, a splash of almond milk, served at precisely 159 degrees. "Your coffee, Miss Hayes," Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly. "And I've printed the presentation materials for the meeting. I also took the liberty of adding those graphs you mentioned yesterday." Victoria took the coffee without thanks and frowned at the stack of papers. "These aren't stapled correctly," she snapped, tossing them back onto his desk. "The staple should be at exactly a 45-degree angle. Do it again." Thomas nodded quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment as other employees glanced over at the commotion. In her private office, Victoria set down her designer bag and gazed out at the impressive view of the city. 10 years ago, she had started in the mailroom at a smaller company across town. Nobody from those days would recognize her now. She changed everything from her accent to her wardrobe to fit in with the corporate elite. The memories of being overlooked and underestimated still burned, fueling her determination to never go back to being nobody. Her phone buzzed with a message from her boss, congratulating her on securing the Anderson account last week. Victoria smiled smugly. What her boss didn't know was that the account had actually been secured by Lily Chen in the sales department. Victoria had simply put her name on the final paperwork after suggesting Lily take a well-deserved day off. "It's not stealing," Victoria muttered to herself as she practiced her presentation smile in the reflection of her computer screen. It's strategic career advancement. By mid-morning, Victoria was making her rounds through the department, checking on her team's progress. She stopped at the desk of David Wong, one of her newer hires. "Where's the report I asked for yesterday?" she demanded, loud enough for the entire office to hear. David looked up, confusion crossing his face. "I believe that's due next Monday, according to the email you sent." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Are you contradicting me?" "I clearly said I needed it today." She pulled up his email on her phone, quickly scrolling past the part that confirmed David was right. "See, right here. Today. I don't appreciate employees who can't follow simple instructions or meet deadlines." David opened his mouth to defend himself, then thought better of it and nodded. "I'll have it for you by lunch, Miss Hayes." "Make it an hour," Victoria replied, walking away before he could respond. As lunchtime approached, Victoria noticed an elderly janitor, Eleanor, quietly emptying trash bins near the conference room. The old woman moved slowly, her hands slightly trembling as she worked. "You missed a spot," Victoria called out sharply, pointing to a completely clean area of carpet. "And while you're at it, the windows haven't been properly cleaned in days." Eleanor looked up, her gentle eyes meeting Victoria's cold stare. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll take care of it right away." "You people never get it right the first time," Victoria muttered just loud enough to be heard as she walked past. In the executive bathroom, Victoria touched up her makeup and rehearsed her presentation points. The quarterly review meeting would be her chance to impress the board again. She'd take credit for the department's successes while subtly blaming others for any shortcomings. It was a strategy that had worked well so far. "Victoria Hayes, Operations Manager Extraordinaire," she said to her reflection, practicing her most professional smile. Soon to be Victoria Hayes, Vice President. She didn't notice Eleanor quietly mopping the floor in the corner of the bathroom, taking in every word with wise, watchful eyes that missed nothing and remembered everything. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor started working at Westfield Corporate Plaza. She had settled into a routine, arriving early to clean the executive floors before most employees showed up. Today, though, there was a buzz in the air. Important clients were visiting, and the entire 22nd floor was in a state of controlled chaos. Eleanor pushed her cleaning cart quietly down the hallway, careful to stay out of everyone's way. Young assistants rushed past with coffee orders and folders bursting with documents. The conference room at the end of the hall had been transformed, fresh flowers on the table, expensive pastries arranged on silver platters, and water pitchers with actual lemon slices floating in them. "Beat day," Robert whispered as he passed Eleanor in the hallway. "The Anderson people are here. Worth millions, I hear." Eleanor nodded, keeping her head down as she worked. She had already seen the group of visitors arrive, 5 men and 2 women in expensive suits, escorted by James Westfield himself. They had walked right past her, as if she were part of the furniture. That was fine with Eleanor. Being invisible had its advantages. By 11 o'clock, the meeting was in full swing. Through the partially open door, Eleanor could hear Victoria's voice rising and falling with practiced charm as she presented something about quarterly projections. Eleanor waited patiently in the service corridor, knowing that the trash bins would need emptying soon. The building manager had specifically told all maintenance staff to be extra attentive today, but to remain as unobtrusive as possible. At 11:30, Eleanor checked her schedule. The conference room was supposed to be serviced during the client's scheduled lunch break at noon. But as she reviewed the paper, she noticed a last-minute change. Someone had crossed out 12 o'clock and written 11:45 instead. The handwriting wasn't familiar, but Eleanor took note of the change and adjusted her timing accordingly. At 11:43, Eleanor knocked gently on the conference room door before entering with her head bowed respectfully. The conversation inside stopped abruptly as she wheeled her cart in. "Excuse me," she said softly, moving toward the overflowing trash bin in the corner. Victoria, who had been in the middle of describing an impressive growth chart, stopped mid-sentence. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of barely controlled rage. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Elena gestured toward her schedule. "Cleaning service, ma'am. For 11:45. Victoria's face flushed red. She glanced at the important clients, then back at Eleanor. "Are you seriously interrupting this meeting right now?" "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, genuinely confused. "The schedule was changed. I can come back later." "Can't you read the time?" Victoria cut her off, her voice rising. She snatched the schedule from Eleanor's hands and thrust it toward her face. "Or maybe you can't read English at all?" The room fell silent. One of the clients shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another checked his watch, suddenly very interested in the time. Victoria wasn't finished. She made exaggerated hand gestures as if Eleanor couldn't understand basic instructions. "Meeting. Now," she said, speaking unnaturally slowly and loudly. "You. Clean. Later." Elena stood perfectly still, her face calm despite the humiliation. Her eyes, briefly meeting Victoria's, showed no anger. Only a quiet dignity that made Victoria even more furious. "This is why we shouldn't hire these people," Victoria said, turning to the clients with an exasperated laugh. "Always disrupting important business." James Westfield cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take our scheduled break a bit early," he suggested, his voice carefully neutral. "The pastries do look delicious." The clients murmured in agreement, clearly relieved for the interruption. As they filed out of the room, several nodded politely to Eleanor. One older gentleman even whispered, "Sorry about that," as he passed. Left alone in the conference room, Eleanor quietly emptied the trash bins. Her hands worked steadily despite the slight tremble in her fingers. After decades in the corporate world, she was no stranger to rudeness or prejudice, but experiencing it from this perspective, as someone deemed unworthy of basic respect, was different. When Victoria returned 10 minutes later to gather her presentation materials, Eleanor was finishing up the windows. "Don't ever interrupt my meetings again," Victoria hissed. "One more mistake like that, and I'll have you fired. There are plenty of people who would be grateful for this job." Eleanor nodded silently, but as Victoria turned away, she didn't see the calm, assessing look in the older woman's eyes. She didn't notice how Eleanor carefully folded the altered schedule paper and slipped it into her pocket. And she certainly didn't recognize the measured breathing technique that Eleanor used, not to calm herself, but to control her anger. It was the same technique Eleanor had once taught to nervous executives before major business negotiations. That evening, after her shift ended, Eleanor didn't immediately head home. Instead, she walked 6 blocks to a small coffee shop where a silver-haired man in an expensive suit was waiting at a corner table. "Hello, James," she said, sliding into the seat across from her old friend. James Westfield's face was grim. "I saw what happened today, Ellie. I'm so sorry." Eleanor shook her head. "Don't be. That's exactly why I'm here." She took out a small notebook filled with neat handwriting. "And I think we have a lot to discuss about Miss Hayes." The small cafe was quiet as the evening crowd thinned out. In the corner booth, Eleanor and James sat across from each other, their coffee growing cold between them. James looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than when Eleanor had last seen him socially almost 2 years ago. "I was shocked when you agreed to this," James said, his voice low. "When my daughter suggested we needed someone on the inside, I never thought you'd volunteer, especially not as," he gestured vaguely, "a janitor." Eleanor finished with a small smile. "That's exactly why it works, James. No one looks at the cleaning staff. We're furniture to people like Victoria Hayes." James winced. Today was bad. I wanted to say something, but with the Anderson people there. "You did the right thing," Eleanor assured him. "Intervening would have only made it worse and might have blown my cover." She slid her notebook across the table. "Besides, I'm not here to be protected. I'm here to document." James opened the notebook, his eyes widening as he flipped through page after page of detailed notes. Eleanor had recorded dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes. She had documented patterns, which employees Victoria targeted most frequently, which types of comments she made, how behaviors changed depending on who was present. "This is thorough," James murmured. "Very thorough." "I was a CEO for 20 years, Eleanor reminded him with a twinkle in her eye. "Documentation was always my strong suit." "It says here she changed your cleaning schedule deliberately." "To set you up?" Eleanor nodded. "I kept the altered schedule. The handwriting matches sample notes I've seen on her desk." James closed the notebook, troubled. Why would someone go out of their way to humiliate a janitor? What does she gain? "Power," Eleanor said simply. "People like Victoria need someone to look down on. It makes them feel bigger." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "But she's not just targeting me. I've been watching her interactions with all the maintenance staff, the security team, the cafeteria workers. And there's a clear pattern. White employees get her standard rudeness. Everyone else gets something extra. Comments about accents, assumptions about education or intelligence, little digs about being these people." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but her eyes hardened. "It's not random, James. And it's not just Victoria. I've seen 3 other managers following her lead." James ran a hand through his silver hair. "When my father started this company 50 years ago, he had a simple philosophy: respect every person who walks through the door, no matter what job they do." He looked at Eleanor. "I thought we still lived by that." "Companies are like gardens," Eleanor said gently. "Stop tending them, and weeds take over." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 old friends contemplating how things had changed. Outside, the streetlights flickered on as darkness fell. "How's your grandson?" James asked, changing the subject. "Still at medical school." Eleanor's face brightened. "Graduating this spring. Top of his class. And he has no idea his grandmother is playing undercover boss." "None whatsoever," Eleanor chuckled. "He'd have a fit if he knew I was on my hands and knees scrubbing toilets at my age." James smiled. "Always the surprising one, Ellie. Even back in business school, you never did things the expected way." Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. "That's my daughter," she said, checking it quickly. "Wondering why I'm not home yet. She worries. Does she know what you're doing?" "She thinks I'm consulting part-time on a diversity project. Not entirely untrue." Eleanor put away her phone and looked seriously at James. "We need to talk about next steps. I've gathered enough evidence about Victoria, but this is bigger than one bad manager." James nodded. "The board meets next month. I was planning to present something then, but after today." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "We stick to the plan." I need more documentation on the others, and we need a clear pattern to present to your board. Half of those old dinosaurs won't believe it otherwise. Some of them are our age, Ellie, James said with a wry smile. Exactly. Dinosaurs. She stood up, smoothing her simple pants and sweater, so different from the designer suits she once wore. I should get going. Early shift tomorrow. James stood too, hesitating before asking, Are you sure you want to continue? After today? Eleanor fixed him with the same determined look she'd used in boardrooms for decades. James Westfield, when have you ever known me to leave a job half-finished? He smiled, remembering the formidable businesswoman who had once been his toughest competitor and later his most trusted advisor. Never. Then I'll see you next week, same time, same place. Eleanor picked up her worn bag and straightened her shoulders. And James? When this is all over, you're taking me to dinner somewhere much nicer than this cafe. As Eleanor walked to the bus stop, her mind was already planning tomorrow. Victoria would never suspect that the quiet old woman who cleaned her office was building a case that would change everything. That thought made the ache in Eleanor's knees a little easier to bear as she climbed aboard the bus heading home. The Westfield Corporate Plaza buzzed with excitement. The company's annual spring celebration was in full swing, with employees from all departments mingling in the large atrium. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, and tables of food lined the walls. For once, the usual divisions between executives and support staffs seemed less obvious as people chatted in mixed groups, paper plates of cake in hand. Eleanor moved quietly along the edges of the crowd, refilling napkin holders and making sure the trash bins didn't overflow. She had been working at Westfield for almost 6 weeks now, and the routine had settled into her bones. Her body had adjusted to the physical demands of the job, though she still took extra pain medication on days when her arthritis flared up. You should take a break, Eleanor, Robert said, appearing beside her with a small plate of food. They said all staff can enjoy the party too. Eleanor smiled at her friend. Maybe in a little while. The dessert table needs attending first. Robert shook his head but didn't argue. They both knew that joining the celebration would break the invisible barrier that kept maintenance staff separate from the corporate employees. Few would cross that line. Across the room, Victoria Hayes held court among a group of admirers. Her recent acquisition of the Peterson account had made her the star of the month. She looked particularly polished today in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent. She's in rare form today, Robert muttered, following Eleanor's gaze. Already made 2 interns cry. Eleanor watched as Victoria laughed too loudly at something a VP said, her hand touching his arm in a practiced gesture of flattery. Success makes people careless, Eleanor observed quietly. They forget to watch their words. As if proving her point, Victoria's voice carried across the room as she described how she practically had to draw pictures to explain the contract terms to the Peterson Company's foreign representative. Her imitation of the man's accent made several people in her circle shift uncomfortably, but no one objected. Eleanor continued working, making her way closer to the center of the atrium, where a display had been set up showcasing Westfield's accomplishments over the past year. Glass cases held awards and photographs of important events. At the center stood a scale model of the company's planned expansion, a gleaming new building that would double their office space. As Eleanor carefully wiped fingerprints from the glass, Victoria approached the display with several executives in tow. She was explaining something about the marketing strategy for the expansion when she spotted Eleanor. "Make sure you don't leave streaks this time," Victoria said loudly. "Last time you cleaned, the glass looked worse than before." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be careful." She continued working methodically, aware of Victoria watching her with critical eyes. The water in Eleanor's cleaning bucket was getting dirty, and she knew she should change it before finishing the display. As she lifted the bucket to move it, her arthritic hand suddenly spasmed with pain. Water splashed over the edge, splashing onto the floor near the display. Victoria's reaction was immediate and explosive. "What is wrong with you?" she shouted, her voice echoing in the suddenly quiet atrium. "You had one simple job." Eleanor quickly pulled a cloth from her cart to wipe up the spill. "I'm sorry, it was an accident." "This is why we shouldn't hire incompetent old foreigners who barely speak English." Victoria's face was flushed with anger as she pointed at the small puddle on the floor. Look at this mess, right next to our most important display. Around them, conversations had stopped. Dozens of employees stared, frozen in uncomfortable silence. Even those who normally ignored the cleaning staff couldn't pretend not to notice this confrontation. Get down and clean that properly, Victoria demanded, gesturing toward the floor. Elena hesitated only a moment before kneeling down, her knees protesting painfully as she began to wipe up the water. The humiliation burned in her chest, but her face remained calm. She'd experienced worse in her life. On your hands and knees, where you belong, Victoria added in a lower voice, but still loud enough for nearby people to hear. A woman in the front of the crowd gasped softly at the comment. Another turned away, unable to watch, but no one intervened. No one except a tall, elegant woman in her 40s who had just entered the atrium from the main elevators. She wore a tailored gray suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone used to authority. Her dark eyes took in the scene in an instant, her expression changing from professional neutrality to cold anger. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence as she approached Victoria. "What exactly is happening here?" Victoria turned, ready to snap at whoever was interrupting, but her expression changed when she recognized the woman. "Ms. Westfield, I didn't know you were back from your trip to Singapore." Catherine Westfield, James Westfield's daughter and the company's executive vice president, didn't smile. I asked what was happening. Victoria's voice softened to a placating tone. "Just a small accident. The cleaning lady spilled water near our expansion display. I was ensuring it got cleaned up properly." Catherine's eyes moved from Victoria to Eleanor, who was still on her knees, water seeping through her uniform pants. Without hesitation, Catherine stepped forward and offered her hand to the older woman. "Please, let me help you up," she said gently. As Elena rose to her feet with Catherine's assistance, the younger woman spoke quietly. "Are you all right?" Elena nodded, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent communication that Victoria completely missed. Catherine turned back to Victoria, her voice cool and professional. "Ms. Hayes, I'd like to see you in my office. Immediately." As Victoria followed Catherine toward the elevators, the party slowly resumed, though the conversations were more subdued. Robert appeared at Eleanor's side with a fresh bucket of clean water. "You okay?" he asked with genuine concern. Eleanor gave him a small smile, glancing toward the elevators where Victoria had disappeared. "Better than okay, Robert," she said softly. "Sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better." Robert looked confused, but Eleanor just patted his arm and returned to cleaning the display, her movements unhurried despite the excitement building inside her. The plan was moving faster than expected, but that was fine. Elena Chen had always been good at adapting. Victoria barely slept that night. Her meeting with Catherine Westfield had been brief but unsettling. Catherine had asked pointed questions about the incident with the janitor, but offered no hint about what might happen next. Victoria had apologized profusely, explaining that she was under tremendous pressure to maintain high standards and that the display was very important. Catherine had simply nodded, made a few notes, and dismissed her with a cool, "That will be all for now." The next morning, Victoria dressed with extra care, choosing her most expensive suit and spending extra time on her makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She arrived at the office 30 minutes early, determined to show her dedication. The security guard looked surprised when she greeted him by name for the first time ever. Victoria wasn't taking any chances today. She would be on her absolute best behavior until this blew over. At exactly 9:15, Victoria's phone rang. "Ms. Hayes, your presence is requested in the main conference room immediately," her assistant Thomas said, his voice unusually formal. "Who's calling the meeting?" Victoria asked, a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "Mr. Westfield himself." Victoria's heart sank. If James Westfield was involved, this was serious. She checked her reflection in her compact mirror, straightened her jacket, and headed for the conference room with her head held high. Whatever was happening, she would face it with dignity. The hallway seemed longer than usual as Victoria made her way toward the conference room. She noticed several employees watching her pass, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something that looked unsettlingly like satisfaction. Had word of yesterday's incident spread so quickly? When Victoria reached the conference room, she paused to take a deep breath before opening the door. Inside, she found not just James Westfield, but the entire executive board seated around the long table. Catherine Westfield sat at her father's right hand. Several people Victoria didn't recognize were also present, including a woman who appeared to be taking notes. But what made Victoria's blood run cold was the empty chair at the head of the table. The chair that was clearly meant for her. "Miss Hayes, please come in," James said, his tone giving nothing away. "We have matters to discuss." Victoria walked to the empty chair on shaky legs. As she sat down, the door opened again behind her. Victoria turned, expecting perhaps HR or legal counsel. Instead, she saw Eleanor Chen, but not the Eleanor she knew. This Eleanor wore not a janitor's uniform, but an impeccably tailored navy blue suit. Her grey hair was styled in an elegant bob rather than the tight bun Victoria was accustomed to seeing. She carried a leather portfolio and walked with the confident posture of someone used to commanding respect. Victoria blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "I believe most of you know Dr. Eleanor Chen," James said, standing to greet her. "Former CEO of Asia Global Financial, Harvard Business School professor, and the consultant I hired 3 months ago to evaluate our company culture." The room was silent as Eleanor took a seat directly across from Victoria. Their eyes met across the table, and Victoria felt a chill run through her body. The quiet, seemingly meek janitor was gone, replaced by a woman whose gaze held decades of authority and sharp intelligence. "Miss Hayes," James continued, "Dr. Chen has been conducting an undercover assessment of our workplace environment. Her focus has been on how employees at all levels experience their time at Westfield, with particular attention to equality, respect, and inclusion." Victoria's mouth went dry. "Undercover?" she managed to say. Eleanor opened her portfolio. "Yes, Miss Hayes. For the past 6 weeks, I've been working as part of your maintenance staff." Her voice was different too, confident, articulate, with the slight crispness of someone used to being listened to. This approach provided me with an unfiltered view of how people behave when they think no one important is watching. Victoria felt sweat forming on her back as Eleanor began laying out documents on the table. She recognized her own handwriting on the altered cleaning schedule. Next came printed emails, photographs, and pages of handwritten notes. "What I found," Eleanor continued, her voice steady, "was a pattern of behavior that directly contradicts Westfield's stated values of respect and dignity for all. Would you like me to share some specific examples, Miss Hayes?" Victoria couldn't speak. The room seemed to be spinning around her. Catherine Westfield leaned forward. "Dr. Chen has documented 27 separate incidents involving you personally, Ms. Hayes. Incidents where employees were belittled, humiliated, or discriminated against based on their age, race, or position within the company. And unfortunately," James added, his face grave, "you're not the only manager who has been engaging in this behavior. But you are, according to Dr. Chen's findings, the primary source from which this toxic culture has spread." Eleanor placed a final document on the table. "This is a comprehensive report of my findings, including testimony from 17 employees who experienced or witnessed discriminatory behavior. I've included recommendations for addressing these issues at both the individual and organizational levels." Victoria stared at the stack of evidence before her. All those times she thought no one was watching. All those comments she believed no one important would remember or report. All collected and documented by the old janitor she had humiliated just yesterday. I can explain," Victoria began, her voice barely audible. "I'm sure you can," Eleanor replied calmly. "And you'll have that opportunity during your meeting with HR immediately following this one." She closed her portfolio and looked directly at Victoria. "In my experience, Ms. Hayes, character is not what you display when everyone is watching. It's what you do when you think no one who matters can see you." Victoria's office no longer felt like her own as she packed her personal items into a cardboard box. The framed awards, the designer pen set, the small crystal paperweight she bought to celebrate her first big account, all went into the box with mechanical movements. Her mind was still reeling from everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. The HR meeting had been brief and to the point. There would be no second chances, no probationary period. The evidence Eleanor Chen had collected was too substantial, the pattern too clear. Victoria had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending termination. Need any help? Thomas asked from the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. Victoria shook her head without looking up. She couldn't bear to see the relief in her assistant's eyes. Over the last 2 days, she'd learned that Thomas had been keeping a journal of her various offenses for months. He wasn't the only one. Outside her office window, rain streaked down the glass, matching Victoria's mood. 6 years of climbing the corporate ladder at Westfield, gone in an instant, all because of an old woman with a mop who turned out to be so much more. Security will escort you out when you're finished, Thomas added before walking away. Victoria placed the last item in her box, a photo of herself at last year's charity gala. In the picture, she was smiling broadly, surrounded by executives who now wouldn't return her calls. Funny how quickly things changed. As the security guard led her through the building, Victoria noticed how employees turned away, suddenly busy with paperwork or phone calls. No one wanted to make eye contact. No one offered a goodbye. It was as if she had already been erased. In the lobby, a familiar figure stood near the reception desk. Eleanor Chen, back in her business attire, was chatting with James Westfield. They'd both looked up as Victoria approached. Victoria stopped, her box clutched tightly against her chest. Part of her wanted to walk past without acknowledgement, but something made her step toward them instead. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice hoarse. "I suppose you got what you wanted." Eleanor's expression showed no triumph, only a calm seriousness. "This was never about what I wanted, Ms. Hayes. It was about what this company needed." James cleared his throat. "Victoria, I hope you understand that this decision wasn't made lightly. The evidence Dr. Chen collected—" "Save it," Victoria interrupted. "I've heard it all in HR. Hostile work environment. Discrimination. Pattern of behavior." She looked directly at Eleanor. "I still don't understand why you went to all this trouble. Why not just come in as yourself from the beginning?" Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. "Would you have shown me your true self if you'd known who I was? Would anyone?" The simple question hung in the air between them. Victoria had no answer. "Sometimes," Eleanor continued gently, "people only show their real character when they think no one of consequence is watching. When I was the invisible janitor, I saw the truth of this company, both the good and the bad." Victoria shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping. "So what happens now? You write your report, collect your consultant fee, and move on to the next company." "Actually," James interjected, "Dr. Chen has agreed to stay on as our special advisor for workplace culture. She'll be overseeing our new diversity and inclusion initiatives." Victoria felt a final twist of humiliation. Not only had she lost her job, but her replacement would be the very person who had exposed her. "Congratulations," she said flatly. "I hope you enjoy my office." "I won't be taking your office," Eleanor replied. "I'll be working from various departments, spending time with employees at all levels." Her eyes met Victoria's with unexpected kindness. "People can change, Ms. Hayes. This moment doesn't have to define your entire career." Victoria stared at her, searching for mockery or condescension but finding neither. With a curt nod, she turned and walked toward the exit, the security guard following a respectful distance behind. Outside, the rain had stopped, though gray clouds still hung over the city. Victoria stood on the sidewalk, suddenly uncertain where to go. Her phone buzzed with an email notification, a request to connect from a recruiter she knew. Heart lifting slightly, she opened it, only to find a brief message. "Heard about Westfield? Sorry, but we can't risk the association right now. We'll keep you in mind for the future." 6 more similar messages waited in her inbox. Word had spread quickly. 3 months later, Victoria sat in a small office that felt nothing like her corner space at Westfield. The desk was plain laminate, the chair slightly wobbly, the window overlooking not a steady view but a brick wall. The company was a fraction of Westfield's size, the salary less than half of what she'd earned before. "Hayes, these reports were due yesterday," her new manager said, dropping a folder on her desk. Priya Kumar, a woman 10 years Victoria's junior, didn't bother hiding her impatience. "This is the 3rd deadline you've missed this month." "I'll have them done by lunch," Victoria promised, avoiding eye contact. She'd learned quickly that her old excuses didn't work here. See that you do, Pryor replied, and the Richardson account called again with questions. I need you to address them properly this time, not with the dismissive email you sent yesterday. As Pryor walked away, Victoria fought the familiar surge of resentment. She'd been lucky to get this job at all, and she knew it. Every interview had included uncomfortable questions about her departure from Westfield. The story had spread through industry circles, leaving her with few options. Opening the folder, Victoria began reviewing the reports. On her desk sat a newspaper, folded open to a business article she'd been avoiding all morning. The headline read, "Westfield sets new standard for inclusive workplace culture." The accompanying photo showed James and Catherine Westfield alongside Eleanor Chen at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the company's new Employee Development Center. The article detailed Westfield's transformation over the past 6 months, the diversity training programs, the mentorship initiatives, the promotion of previously overlooked employees from various backgrounds. Victoria stared at Eleanor's smiling face in the photo. The woman who had changed everything, including Victoria herself. "Hayes," Pryor called from across the office. "Can you help Lai with the client presentation? He could use your experience with visual layouts." Victoria looked up at her boss, then at Lai, a new hire who had been struggling with his first major project. 6 months ago, she would have complained about babysitting junior staff. Now, she simply nodded. "Sure," she said, standing up. "Happy to help." As she walked over to Lee's desk, Victoria realized something surprising. The burning resentment that had been her constant companion since leaving Westfield had faded slightly. In its place was something unfamiliar. A quiet understanding of Eleanor Chen's final words to her. People can change. This moment doesn't have to define your entire career. Perhaps, Victoria thought as she pulled up a chair beside her young colleague, it was finally time to prove that true.